From where is it that Frida inherited her distinctive unibrow? What role did politics play in her masterpieces, and why did she change her date of birth from 1907 to 1910? That and more in today's video. Hi everyone, today I'm going to go over a bit of Frida Kahlo's family tree, which she painted in her infamous portrait or masterpiece, My Grandparents, My Parents, and I. And through this exercise, we are going to trace where it is that she inherited her beautiful distinctive features, namely her unibrow. Spoiler alert, it is from one of her grandmothers. Which one? Well, Hayden Herrera notes it in her masterful book, Frida, a Biography of Frida Kahlo. About the origin of Frida Kahlo's most distinctive physical characteristic, there can be no doubt. She inherited her heavy, joined eyebrows from her father's mother. Of her features, Frida said she looked like both of her parents. I have my father's eyes and my mother's body. I love that she makes this distinction. So why am I doing this series? I'm doing this series because I owe a lot to Frida Kahlo. When I was growing up, one of my biggest goals was just to fit in. And while I achieved this goal to some degree of success, I wasn't altogether there. I'm Mexican from Mexico. And in the process of trying to fit in, I kind of lost track of the beauty of my heritage. And in saying that, I think that being American, because yes, I'm Mexican American, and identity has always been something that I struggle with. Like, what is my identity? Am I Mexican? Am I Mexican American? Am I American? What does it mean to be each one of those? And I say this because I have people who I love and respect who have told me that I'm one or the other or the other. Ultimately, it's down to you, your person, and what you think in your heart is most aligned with who you are. I have come to the conclusion that I am an American of Mexican heritage, and I need to do a better job of being more intentional about honoring my Mexican heritage. And that's where I've landed, and it's because of my studying Frida Kahlo and her story and how she lived her life and how she honored her people, Goodness gracious. Why are kitties so curious? Every time you close the door, they want to come in, but if you have the door open, they have no interest in being inside here. Anyway, if I haven't already introduced myself, I am Jessica Gonzalez-Gibson, the leading lady of Kaleidoscopes and Book Dots, a handmade, vintage-inspired jewelry store that honors Hispanic American heritage. Ergo, another reason why I am covering this series. And yes, I have started this series on and off throughout the years. This is the year. This is the year that we're going to go through it. If you are interested in shopping any of the pieces that I sell and make, I would love for you to sign up for my newsletter so that you could also save 20%. It's the best way also to stay in touch and to know when it is that I post another one of these videos of this series. Let's get started with today's video. Frida Kahlo's painting, My Grandparents, My Parents, and I. Her family tree. She finished it in 1936. And why is this important? It's important because it speaks to her heritage. She is of German heritage, and that side of history heavily influenced this piece of work. Let's talk about a little bit of Nazi history. So according to MOMA.org, Kahlo painted this work a year after Nazi Germany enforced the Nuremberg laws. And what were these? They were, as outlined by the National World War II Museum, anti-Semitic laws enacted in Nazi Germany on September 15th, 1935. They defined Jewish identity racially rather than religiously and stripped Jews of their citizenship and rights. These laws included the prohibition of marriage and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews, laying the groundwork for further persecution during the Holocaust. So, who was a Jew according to the Nuremberg race laws? A person with 3 or 4 grandparents was a Jew. grandparent was considered Jewish if they belonged to the Jewish religious community. So back to the painting. Before I get started on talking about the portrait, I just must say that this portrait, in my opinion, is one of the portraits or the paintings that best shares with us, the audience, both Frida's activism and her sense of humor, because we know that Frida's mom was incredibly pious. So to see Frida depicting herself as a zygote, a fetus, and as a child of about 2 years old, I mean, can you imagine what an incredibly pious woman would think of seeing this? And let's talk about that. In this masterpiece, she is standing as a 2-year-old in the patio of her infamous blue house, and her parents, as they did in their wedding portrait right above her. Her maternal grandparents, Antonio Calderon, who was of indigenous heritage, and Isabel Gonzalez-Gonzalez, a Spanish beauty, appear over the Mexican mountain ranges. Her paternal grandparents, Jacob Henrik Kahlo, a jeweler who was also sold photography supplies, and Henriette Kaufman Kahlo appear over the Atlantic Ocean. Of this portrait, Hayden Herrera further elaborates it in her book, Frida Kahlo, The Paintings, a separate book from Frida Kahlo, a biography of Frida Kahlo. Frida Kahlo holds the loop of a ribbon that is her bloodline and that supports her family tree as easily as if it were the string of a balloon. One wonders, why did she loop the ribbon, and did she have a reason for placing the loop at the exact spot where her father's and mother's bodies overlap? One hint might be the fetus that is seen in X-ray vision on the skirt of her mother's wedding dress. This must be Frida before she was born. The red loop could be a reference to her mother's sex. For just below the fetus, Frida painted her own conception. A school of sperm appears to have swum through the loop on the way to an egg that has already been fertilized by the fittest competitor. To Frida, her conception was an event so important that nature had to respond. Next to the embryo, a red cactus flower opens to a stream of wind-blown pollen. I also read somewhere that Frida might have thought that her parents got married while her mom was expecting, and hence why it was so quick. I don't know that that's true, but that is something that I read somewhere along the way to this video. Have you heard that? I don't know if it's true. I don't know, but that's a theory. As far as Frida considering that her life was so important that nature had to respond, I think that's another way of saying that Frida understood that her life had a purpose, and that she was consumed with fulfilling that purpose. That is just my interpretation, because I mean, she changed her date of birth from 1907 to 1910 for a very specific reason, and we'll talk about it. But then she also endured so much pain and heartache throughout her life. Why is it that she is in this world if not to fulfill a purpose, even though she has such a heavy cross to bear? And again, that's just me putting this whole thing together in my head. But what do you think? Do you think that Frida was just so narcissistic, that she was just so consumed with her existence that she had to portray herself time and again in all of her pieces of work? No, I just don't see that. I don't see that. Anyway, but if you do, let me know. So Aiden's interpretation of all of this is that, all of this being the portrait, that considering the state of the world, Kahlo's interpretation of a family tree may also represent a counter-representation of the political violence and supremacist ideas that she observed. Whew. Are we done? Okay, let's talk about Guillermo Kahlo's parents. Guillermo Kahlo's parents were Hungarian Jews from Arad. They migrated to Germany and settled in Baden Baden, where Willem, Guillermo's given name, was born in 1872. Okay, so he was born in Baden Baden. How did he end up in Mexico? Because look at Baden Baden. Baden Baden is like the antithesis of Mexico City. It is luscious, it's beautiful. I don't know, I've always dreamed of living in a place like this, and yet he chooses the desert of Mexico. First, let's talk about the events that led up to his decision to move to Mexico. So in 1890, when he was 18 years old, Willem Kahlo Guillermo Kahlo, sustained brain injuries from a fall, and from then on he began to suffer from epileptic seizures, which he would endure for the rest of his life. Around the same time, his mom passed away, and shortly after, his father remarried. Upon his arrival, he changed his name from Willem Kahlo to Guillermo Kahlo, and he would never return to Germany again. So, why Mexico? Of all the places around the world, why Mexico? Well, the move was less of an escape and more of an invitation. Mexico was opening itself to the world under Porfirio Diaz, who actively welcomed European migrants. He wanted engineers, architects, merchants, and artisans to help modernize the nation. Foreign skill carried prestige, and opportunity arrived with fewer gates in Mexico, as opposed to Germany, whose economy was industrializing rapidly, but competition was dense and social mobility was rigid. Mexico City, by contrast, was expanding. Railways, public buildings, and private estates required documentation in the form of photography, and photography was still young there, and the demand exceeded supply. So for a technically trained immigrant, the field was open and luminous. And culturally, Mexico welcomed newcomers. It offered fluidity, whereas German society prized conformity and hierarchy. European aesthetics were admired in Mexico and even sought after rather than taken for granted. And there was a subtle contrast as it relates to politics. Germany in the late 1990s was marked by nationalism and growing social tensions. Let's talk about nationalism because it's often intertwined with Nazism, which, yes, it is what Nazism stems from, but I would say nationalism is overtly practiced around the world presently and not in a bad way. Yet it's still used often to describe something negative. And I can't get behind that. So nationalism is a belief that a people share a common identity and that this shared identity deserves loyalty, protection, and self-rule. It centers on belonging, language, culture, history, memory. Nationalism often appears when a group seeks to define itself, to preserve what feels essential, to reclaim power over its own future. It can express pride and unity, and it can also draw boundaries. At its core, nationalism asks a simple question: who are we together? When I first read this, I thought, that sounds very similar to E Pluribus Unum, which I know to be fundamental in the ethos of what makes us American. E Pluribus Unum is Latin for out of many one. It expresses the idea that distinct peoples, cultures, and histories can unite to form a single civic body. This phrase is found in the Great Seal of the United States. It does not erase differences, it gathers it. The phrase reflects a vision where diversity remains visible, yet allegiance is shared. Many voices, one republic. Many origins, one experiment. In spirit, it speaks to unity without uniformity. A collective identity shaped from plurality, not sameness. E Pluribus Unum. That is the ethos that I can totally get behind. Now back to Mexico. So Mexico, though ruled by an authoritarian regime, projected optimism and progress. Hence why Guillermo would go to Mexico. Stability, infrastructure, investment, and cultural exchange mattered more than ideology to many immigrants of the time. That openness shaped Guillermo Kahlo's path and quietly framed the world that would later inform Frida Kahlo's perspective. So, how is it that Guillermo would come to fall in love with Matilde Calderon, Frida's mother? Well, it wasn't all that easy. In 1894, he married his first wife, and he had 2 daughters with this wife. I don't know her name. If you do, please let me know down below. I have tried to research it, but I have yet to find an answer for that. His second wife, Matilde, Frida's mom, worked alongside Guillermo at La Perla jewelry store. This is where Guillermo fell in love with Matilde. However, of course, he was married, and then he was also Jewish by birth, but an atheist by persuasion. The match was impossible. It wasn't until, tragically, his wife passed away while giving birth to their second daughter that opportunity would arise. And as it happened, Matilde when she wasn't working at the jewelry store, she also assisted her mom as the local nurse or curandera. And when his first wife fell ill, Matilde and her mom were there to assist. Shortly after her passing, Guillermo and Matilde tied the knot in 1898. At the time, she was 24 years old. Let's talk about Matilde. Matilde was born in Oaxaca in 1876. Matilde Calderon y Gonzalez. She was the eldest of 12 children. Her mother, Isabel Gonzalez-Gonzalez, was the daughter of a Spanish general, and her father, Antonio Calderon, was a photographer of Indian descent from Morelia. According to Frida, her mother was intelligent, though uneducated, and what she lacked in education, she made up for in piety. And this would be a source of friction between the two of them for their entire life. Although that didn't mean that there wasn't a lot of affection between the two of them. It just meant that their relationship was very complicated. Now, Guillermo, on the other hand, was educated, intelligent, hardworking, and handsome. Many of these qualities, of course, are exhibited through Frida Kahlo. And in fact, Guillermo often thought of Frida as being most like himself. And while he didn't share Matilde's faith, various factors influenced her decision to marry him. Namely, she was 24 years old, beyond the usual age of marriage. And secondly, he reminded her of her first love, a German who would tragically and unthinkably commit suicide in her presence. Of course, she would never forget about her first love. Ultimately, though, Frida didn't think that her mom actually really loved her father. Not the way her father loved her, or the way that she, Frida, would love Diego. Okay, let's take a closer look at the painting and also talk about her given name at birth and her date of birth. So Magdalena Carmen Kahlo y Calderon, the third daughter of Guillermo and Matilde Kahlo, was born July 7th, 1907 at 8:30 in the morning in the midst of a summer rainy season when Mexico is cold and dank. Frida's first two names, were given to her so that she could be baptized with a Christian name. Frida would later become agnostic. Her third name, the one that her family used, means peace in German. And while her birth certificate says Frida as we know it, Frida preferred to spell it the German way, with an E. That is, until the late 1930s when Nazism rose to power in Germany. Later in her life, she would change her date of birth to 1910, which was the first year of the Mexican Revolution, which would last a decade and of course take place during Frida's most formative years. As would be evident in most of her masterpieces, if not all of them, I would say, politics were central to every facet of her life. Now, because for a while, a small while, but a while nonetheless, I confused Mexican Independence Day, or the Mexican War of Independence, with the Mexican Revolution. I think it's because the names kind of, to me, sound similar, synonymous. I don't know. For whatever reason, I confused the two. If you two fall under this category and you are not a history buff, let's talk about the differences between the two of them. So, Mexican Independence Day is observed on September 16th, and it marks the beginning of Mexico's break from Spanish colonial rule. Mexican Independence Day commemorates the Grito de Dolores, or the Cry of Pain, initially led by Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla in 1810. It celebrates the birth of the nation itself. The Mexican War of Independence lasted 11 years, and it began on September 16th, 1810, and formally ended with Mexico's independence from Spain in 1821. So let's talk about the Grito de Dolores, the Cry of Pain. The movement began with a call to action issued by Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla, who was a Catholic priest, who urged the people of New Spain, Mexico's name at the time, to rise against Spanish rule. The moment is remembered as symbolic birth of the nation. This was the war of social inequality. The conflict was driven by deep divisions between Spanish-born elites, Mexico-born Spaniards, and indigenous peoples and mixed-race populations. Economic exploitation, rigid class systems, and lack of political voice fueled widespread unrest. After Hidalgo's execution in 1811, The movement continued under leaders such as José María Morelos, who gave the struggle clear political structure and articulated ideas of sovereignty, equality, and the abolition of caste distinctions. The war unfolded in phases. Early on, there were uprisings, then there were the years of guerrilla resistance, and a final political realignment that made independence possible. Momentum came slowly, shaped by exhaustion, shifting alliances, and global pressures on Spain. So independence was secured in 1821 through the Plan of Iguala and the formation of the Trigarante Army, which united former royalists and insurgents under shared principles, which were independence from Spain, Catholicism as the state religion, equality between Spaniards and Mexicans, and ultimately, the Mexican War of Independence was a fight for sovereignty, a challenge to colonial hierarchy, and it was the birth of a national identity. Why is it that September 16th is celebrated instead of the war's end? Because it marks the awakening, not the conclusion. It marks Mexico's beginning as a nation, later distinct from the Mexican Revolution, which sought to redefine justice within the nation. One celebrates the nation's beginning, the other its transformation. So now let's take a look at the Mexican Revolution, which was pivotal for Frida. The Mexican Revolution took place between 1910 and 1920, and it marks a struggle to redefine justice within an existing nation. The Mexican Revolution was a decade-long conflict sparked by inequality and dictatorship. It reshaped Mexico's laws, identity, and social fabric. It was not a birth, it was a reckoning. The spark? The revolution erupted in opposition to the long dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, whose regime favored elites while deepening inequality. A call for change was directed by Francisco Madero, who called for democratic reform, igniting widespread rebellion after contested elections. Unfortunately, though, as happens in many of these uprisings, the movement fractured into regional struggles, led by figures such as Emiliano Zapata in the south, advocating for land reform, and Pancho Villa in the north, commanding popular armies. Power shifted rapidly and repeatedly through alliances, betrayals, and civil war. The conflict revealed deep tensions over land, labor, and political voice. The revolution culminated in the 1917 Constitution, which introduced land redistribution, labor rights, and limits on centralized power, shaping modern Mexico. In essence, the Mexican Revolution honors the fight for equality, voice, and reform, topics that were central to Frida's work. So let's finish off this presentation with how the Mexican Revolution shaped Frida Kahlo's identity. Frida Kahlo clearly aligned herself with a revolutionary transformation. She famously claimed that her date of birth was 1910 instead of 1907, deliberately placing her life alongside the Mexican Revolution. This choice reflects a belief in becoming, not inheritance. Identification with struggle, not ceremony, a personal bond with reform, pain, and renewal, topics that are so prevalent in her work. In her paintings, ancestry and politics intertwine, and bloodlines are visible. That is why I absolutely love her work. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please give me a big thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and do sign up for my newsletter to stay informed when I post another video. Hopefully it'll be next Friday. All things considered, all things being technology, are on my side. Also, if you haven't done so already, please register to vote. Your vote matters more than you know, more than you could ever imagine. I'll talk to you again very soon.